Ça marche. Très bien. Donc, so I speak French again. Bad habit. So we were talking about the Tio Kingdom, and so then the next book was Children of Woot.
Woot, yes.
So back in the Democratic Republic of the Congo here, and the Cuba.
Right.
After your PhD.
So that book was one that I felt more and more was necessary to write to correct or to complement the earlier work. You know, earlier first I'd published basically what amounts to all the raw data with some explanations in the PhD in Dutch, which was essentially my unchanged PhD version from 1957 or something like that. But that was clearly not enough. And it was clearly rough in that it essentially gave the vision of what people told me, and what the people who told me were all people basically essentially in the capital, and they were all related to the royal family in one way or another, which one could find in a graph here and there. So it became more and more evident that this was if you want, the vision on the past of that elite group, but not necessarily what had really happened.
Did you realize that because of the Tio Kingdom book?
Well, I realized that as I was working, in the 60s in general, whatever I was working, because it was obvious in Rwanda.
Yeah.
Rwanda is a parallel situation where the first thing you get is quote unquote the official version.
Right.
And then you see that it doesn't work. Now this one became possible because as I was thinking this over, I also realized, and I did realize this early on, from the earliest 60s on, that you could use language and linguistics to check on some historical data. And I had done that, by the way, in the Tio Kingdom already, or around it. So I decided to do this seriously. And because we knew by then, by the later 60s and early 70s, that there was a relationship between the Kuba language and the languages from the Central Forest in Congo, for which there is a magnificent dictionary, the Mongol dictionary, which at the time was one of the 3 best in anywhere in Bantu studies. So I decided to systematically compare, my whole vocabulary with the whole vocabulary I had with the Mongol vocabulary, and see if I could find out what kind of relationships there were and if they were regular. And I found an enormous amount of data. I found data not only on Bouchon words that are related to the Mongol ones and have a common ancestry or not. I also found a lot about Bouchon loan words from other languages like Chiluba and from other languages still. So, but that was all full of historical information. And this was information that had not been used, at least not in African studies or African history as far as I know, by anyone. It had been used in Europe for European problems, but only to a very partial degree and in a very biased way during the 1930s to establish, basically it had been used mostly by those who wanted to try to show that there was a Germanic undertow in most of Western Europe that was older or more important than whatever Roman thing there was, and it was extremely flawed. It was, it was 1920s, 1930s, and mostly in Holland, by the way. And so I knew that theoretically this could be done, but I also knew something about what not to do.
But still, you were a bit improvising on your own.
Yes.
Yeah, and I see the list of the lexical list is enormous. It's,
So yes, I used a huge amount of lexical data.
Lexical
And
comparison.
I put them in appendix. I got the university press to approve all of this and to do this.
And they said yes.
And to publish it.
It's almost 100 pages.
Yes, I know.
Yes.
It's it's based on what 3,000 Cuba Bouchon words,
Right.
and there are comparisons in many other languages.
Right.
So it was a big job. It took many years, and once I had the results, then it became clear in which ways that elite history had in fact diverged from or was different from what had basically been going on. So you get a hybrid book. You get a book with a first part that gives you the history according to the establishment.
Right.
And then you get a second part which gives you the history according to all other data, for about the same period. And the data are synthesized. Of course, you're not going to give each of these little things separately, so they're synthesized and they begin to make sense.
Right.
The economic data make a lot of sense.
There's a very important economic chapter again on the who and the Corey.
Now, of course, if I had to rewrite this, I would still change some things.
Really?
I think I would. There would be more information to share, more doubts, in fact, and you can analyze further for early periods in Cuba history than what I have here. I do not think that before the mid 18th century or early 18th century the data are all that safe, and at the time it was difficult to see, but now we know from the analysis of objects and styles, and also from looking again at the genealogy, and not just me, but a number of other researchers, that essentially, yes, you are sure of your chronology down to about 1700.
Right.
And before that, it's clear that nothing is really pinned down. It has also become more visible to me since then, because of practice, that amongst the early stories, we have a lot of what anthropologists would call myths, and what de Hirsch later handled as myths. In other words, they are made-up stories that come from other stories, that come either from general tales that were told around, or have some local input and then some general input mixed. It's very hard to say what. But you know that you cannot trust them to the level of what you can after about 1700. And when you do that, and when I add something we may talk about perhaps later, what I now know about how memory works, it is clear to me that if I had to rewrite this, I should start this as a real history. I should start this around 1700 and not say 1600 or earlier. So that's that.
So it makes me think that maybe the next book we could talk about, maybe not today but another day, would be the third installment of your Cuba history, which is being colonized, and see how, because so this was, did you do more field research for this one?
No.
No, so you use what you had in your PhD, your dissertation, plus the vocabulary.
Right, plus others, plus a few additional data, like what early travelers were told, what the earliest missionary in the region, shepherd, was told, what the earliest businessman, Vermeulen, whose data became only available in 2012, the manuscript data.
You didn't have it at the time?
Oh, no, 2012 is much later.
Right,
I didn't even know that existed. Well, they also has a little comment. I also saw the original notes of Frobenius later on, who also has some comment on this. What these things do is they tell me, these early writers, they tell me essentially not only what the official versions were around 1900, but who told whom, what to whom. So I can track down, let's say, the versions in early writers such as Daudet or Frobenius to one particular person who was a person who had been sheltered by the American mission, but they don't know about this, about the American mission in 1896, and exactly where in the genealogy all of this comes together. So, you know, how more vulnerable all of this is than it looks later on, you know.
So, is this after the Children of Woot that you, or before, when did you write oral history, the book on oral history?
The second one.
Yes.
The second one I would write later, but, you know, ever since the original oral history, which was published 1960, 1965 in English, and it's the English version.
So the oral history was right after the Tio Kingdom, or before the Tio
No,
Kingdom?
the original oral history was written in
65, isn't it?
1956,
56?
but that was not published.
I see.
And it then served for the PhD in 1957. I added all to 57 and 60.
Okay.
I then wrote a French version in 1960, which I deposited in Belgium before I came here.
Right.
That was published in Belgium.
Right.
De la Tradition Orale is 1960.
Okay.
And it was translated and published in English 5 years later.
Right, 65.
And I never saw the
66.
translation. There are some real mistakes in that
There are
translation.
mistakes.
Oh,
Really?
yes.
Right. So yeah, so I was just curious if so the book De la Tradition Orale and Oral History had not been influenced by your revisiting of the Cuba history.
Well, all of that was in there, you know.
Yes,
Of course, you see, you can also see this in the Journal of African History. If you look at the very first issue of the journal, it has supposedly a Cuba history in it. But it has two parts. Part one is oral tradition.
Right.
And of course, for a PhD, you realize that if you're going to have a PhD in history, you first have to explain how your sources can be valid. So the whole Tradition Orale was just an introduction.
Your methodological introduction.
Yes, to the Cuba history.
Right. Okay. So, would you like us to talk a little bit of past, or do you want us to wait for that next time?
Well, I think perhaps it's better to wait for parts for next time, because it's a long story.
It's a very long story. Do you think maybe we could have 5-10 minutes? Jumping ahead.
Yes, of course.
On the being colonized.
Yes.
So because being colonized, correct me if I'm wrong, but so it's your third and final.
Yes.
You didn't go back in between, right? You didn't go
No,
back
I
to
did
Cuba.
not go back in between, but I accumulated more sources. And in fact, I had sources that I had not used in these Cuba histories,
sure.
because they were for the colonial period.
Right.
So, and I had published.
But you had collected them.
I had collected them. I had published articles in French and published in Kinshasa, essentially 2 or 3, making a total of 100 to 150 pages on that colonial period. But you know, as we will see when you look at being colonized, this was a way of explaining history in general, using the Cuba only as one example, because you did have, by the time I wrote it, a lot of material that showed, that came from the side. It didn't come from the top, it didn't come from the very bottom. Some of it did, but most of it came from what has been called sideways
Right.
information. But it shows much better how people accept, are being colonized than exactly the official versions of how civilization or whatever it is imposed, or the anti-version, how the iron hand of such and such imposes stuff.
Right, and so and it also covers a period that you did not really cover.
No, we covered the period that had not covered
right.
on purpose in the earlier work.
Mm-hmm.
So
and using a really Cuba viewpoint on what happened to them.
I used all the oral history, that I had gathered when I was there, and I admit that I could have gathered more, except that people didn't want to talk about it very much.
And also
this was the colonial period, and they weren't too sure yet.
Yeah.
They were beginning to be too sure, but they were beginning to be sure enough, but not enough yet. Also, there were major differences between the capital, which was relatively well protected, and outlying villages that were sometimes much worse off. So that would have required, again, an aerial survey and an aerial study that might have taken a year or a year and a half to have enough divergent histories and enough point of views from all layers of society to really come to a firm conclusion.
Right.
And I didn't.
But you do, because you have also the dreams.
Well, you see, I have
of the dreams.
Yes, I have some of that information. I also have indirect material, from such things as tax records I'd collected.
Right.
Indirect indications as to who collected the taxes actually.
Right. And the factories and all the movements of the slaves and
yes,
and the refugees.
That comes out of judicial documents, OPG, officier de police judiciaire, which and they were supposed to write down what witnesses said, more or less literally, and never literally really, but often, if they were devoted to it, the agents, it would come out in great detail, and there were a few of these very detailed cases in that history that help fill in the background.
And did you also the sources we were talking about together from the factory agents and the...
No, I did not have that information yet.
Yet. That was later.
It's at the point when that book was written, I was looking for this person because I knew that he'd written 2 novels, and I'd read the novels, and I realized they were based on personal information, but I could not use much of that information. I used a little because it's not guaranteed whether this is fiction or fact. And whatever you say, you have to know.
Yeah.
So it's only after that book was written that it fell by chance, a reference to it fell by chance in the hands of this Dutch person who was looking for somebody who knew about his grandparent, and his grandparent's name was in there. So the name was authentic. And he contacted me by email and so on and so forth.
Right. So what happened to these archives? You didn't have a chance.
Well, the archive, we prepared it completely electronically. And by the way, the person who found it is an electronic expert. So we really prepared everything. The whole book is finished, the footnotes are finished and everything. It was going to be published by a well-known Dutch publisher, the Koninklijk Instituut, the Royal Institute for Tropical Studies in Amsterdam. But they went bankrupt.
Oh.
They are a state institution, but they were bankrupt. They could no longer publish it. So after that, it went to several other publishers, each of whom tried to see if it could be published, and basically they found that they couldn't do it. It also was submitted at that point to a Belgian series on Africa, in an official one, and they decided to put it up, God knows, maybe 10 years or 15 years, in favor of such things as, reactions to Kimbangu by the Protestant missions, you know, stuff like that.
But I'm not sure I understand who wrote the book then. This person who.
The person.
It's a book or it's a catalog
no.
of.
You see, what happened is that the grandfather, the person we're talking about, wrote his memoirs, and he wrote and rewrote his memoirs.
Oh, so it's a book with the memoirs,
and the book is basically an edition of his memoirs.
I see.
And because the memoirs are so long,
right,
and he had rewritten several versions of it, so it essentially is always, if possible, the latest version. Mm-hmm. And if there are variants, they are indicated the latest version of the memoirs. But it is essentially an edition of memoirs with the types of annotations that you have, like text annotations and then footnotes and then background information on the person. Right. By now, the descendant of this ancestor has found out practically everything there is to know. We started with nothing and we ended up with knowing when he was divorced, why he was divorced, how he remarried, what he tried to do in between. And in a way it's become interesting as a career history for somebody who wants to work, for somebody who worked in the colonies and who was also trying to find a foot in his own country and start a business there, and it wouldn't work, and then he would go back to and it is one of those complicated stories.
But so is he a very good observer?
Right. So right now, at this moment, that version is with an archive in The Hague, which is an archive that specializes in memoirs and the like of former colonials, wherever, and mostly in the Dutch Indies, of course, being Holland. But we're still hoping that we are going to get a publisher because people are interested, but it is a question of funding, and we will still come up with some funding.
Right. So maybe we can stop here and
start next time again.
Exactly. I think the